What we see now is a war against reality. It's a war against the truth. The government is injecting into the minds of every American citizen what they will believe. This is beyond George Orwell. This is on a scale more massive than anything Orwell contemplated. Orwell knew about television, telescreens, two-way telescreens, but Orwell never contemplated that we'd have technology so portable, so intrusive. No matter where someone's located, they cannot escape this grid that they find themselves embedded in. My first job in journalism was with my high school newspaper, which was a very political, we had our own political slants, and we were very much opposed to Richard Nixon's administration. And Nixon tried to go after the press, but the press retaliated and exposed Nixon. Nixon wound up resigning before he faced certain conviction by the U.S. Senate after his impeachment by the House of Representatives. But what we have in President Obama is somebody much worse than Richard Nixon, much worse than George W. Bush. Barack Obama has brought 7 espionage charges against people in the government who brought information about government wrongdoing, whistleblowers, if you will. Some people call them truth tellers, brought information to the media. President Obama has indicted 8 individuals, if we now include Edward Snowden as the 8th. None of President Obama's predecessors, all put together since the Espionage Act was passed in 1917 by President Woodrow Wilson, no predecessor has indicted so many people under the Espionage Act. In fact, most presidents never used the Espionage Act, but President Obama has indicted more people under the Espionage Act than all of his predecessors combined since the administration of Wilson. And this has sent a chill through the investigative journalism community in Washington and around the country. Journalists are now afraid to talk to sources because they don't want to expose their sources. Sources are, in fact, afraid to talk to a journalist because of the fear they may be indicted and sent to prison for an awfully long time. We've seen President Obama and his Attorney General, Eric Holder, conduct illegal surveillance against over 100 reporters and editors of the Associated Press, a Fox News reporter who covers the State Department, a New York Times reporter, Jim Risen, who had a source within the government. They're trying to get the New York Times reporter Risen to sit and testify before a grand jury to expose his source. This is rather unprecedented, and even Richard Nixon, as much as he may want to have done some of these things, knew what his constraints were, and we never even saw this type of activity at the height of Watergate. Everything that's been released by Ed Snowden was pretty well known. It was the subject of a European Union investigation by the EU Parliament in the 99-2000 timeframe. It was a subject of a number of magazine articles, newspaper articles, and was in Jim Bamford's book, The Shadow Factory. And the only real new information we got was the intensity and the size of NSA's surveillance network and some of the new code words assigned to some of the surveillance projects. What we were told about was metadata surveillance, capturing data off the transatlantic 14 cable, TET-14. This was a joint operation between NSA and its sister activity in Britain called the Government Communications Headquarters, GCHQ. The tap of the cable was done at a facility in Cornwall, and the project, according to the information released by Snowden, was called Tempora. That was new information. The fact that the cables were being tapped, and not just the one going from Cornwall to New Jersey, but many other cables around the world were also being similarly tapped. What we were told about was the NSA's cover term for that operation, Tempora. We also know that PRISM, this metadata collection project, was also revealed by Snowden. We had not heard that name before, although there is a commercial product that basically does the same thing that's offered up by a federal contractor called Palantir. We've seen attacks on journalists in the past, but we've also seen journalists around the country try to expose those who murdered journalists. In 1976, a very brave journalist named Don Bowles was investigating the mafia in Phoenix, Arizona, and it got into a lot of areas that were uncomfortable to a lot of people. And Don Bowles got into his car and it blew up, but before he died, he urged people to continue the investigation he started. And the investigative reporters and editors group was founded basically in his name. Journalists came together, but nowadays, when a Michael Hastings dies in his car, in a manner very similar to what happened to Don Bowles, we have people that are just, oh, it must be an accident. They're going along with the flow. They're not questioning the Los Angeles Police Department. Every journalist should question anybody from the government. White House Press Secretary Jay Carney should not have this love fest that he has in these White House press conferences. They should be confrontational by nature, but they're not. They're just, you know, they might as well be coffee clutches where the journalists get together and talk about the weather and, you know, what Carney's weekend plans are. But that's essentially what we have today. We don't have a confrontational press. And if we get a reporter in the White House or at the Pentagon or at a State Department briefing who gets a little confrontational, they have their press credentials pulled. And without credentials, without access, you no longer have a job in the corporate media. Michael Hastings, of course, did try to bring to the attention of the American people what was going on behind the scenes, as any true investigative journalist would do. But one evening in Los Angeles, his car literally blew up and he was burned beyond recognition. And here again, we have another case of yet another journalist dying under mysterious causes. The corporate press goes along their merry old way and believes everything that the LA Police Department is telling it, just as the corporate press destroyed the career of enterprising investigative journalist Gary Webb, who we were told shot himself twice in the head. He exposed the whole CIA cocaine operation. And we've seen it in other cases with journalists who are not as well known, but definitely we're looking into very egregious situations with private companies, government, so forth and so on. President Obama has waged a war on the press in the United States unlike any of his predecessors. It has sent a chill through the journalistic community in Washington and all around the country. I've been to countries where there is no freedom of the press, where dictators ruled, and I have seen how journalists are harassed by secret police, they're followed, they're wiretapped, they're intimidated, they're harassed. But I always came back to the United States knowing, well, at least we can do our job here. That is no longer the case. With President Obama, we now have widespread surveillance of journalists, intimidation like we've never seen before. And President Obama has brought about a tyranny over the fourth estate in the United States that has only been seen in the recent past in despotic regimes in many developing countries around the world. Where the corporate press should be holding Obama's feet to the fire as they did Nixon, we don't see anything even closely approaching that with the corporate media. We see people who frankly aren't even journalists reporting on major stories or underreporting major stories or ignoring major stories. They're celebrities. They're not journalists. Anderson Cooper, for example, and people like him who are entertainers more than anything else. That is what the American people are being given a daily dosage of, and the Fourth Estate is suffering as a result. Back in the 1960s, Theodore White, the famous presidential election historian, wrote a series of books on every election for president called The Making of the President, how Madison Avenue conducted these basically advertising campaigns. This is how they created the new Nixon in 1968. Not the old Nixon, who was defeated in 1960 for president and the 1962 gubernatorial campaign in California. We now had the new Nixon. The new Nixon was sold like any kind of dish detergent was. It was a product. But with Obama, we've seen the making of the president actually become the manufacturing of a president, because President Obama, when compared to all of his predecessors, we know very, very little about his background, his education, many, many holes in his record, many holes in his employment record. There just is not the degree of scrutiny on President Obama as there was on past presidents, because President Obama in many ways is the first manufactured from whole cloth president, from the time he was a college student to the time he worked for a CIA front company in New York called Business International Corporation, to the time he spent as a community organizer in Chicago, where many people didn't trust his bona fides as far as being a real community organizer, to the time he spent at Harvard Law School, to the time he supposedly taught constitutional law at the University of Chicago. We have a president who has gaping holes in his biography, and very, very few members of the corporate press have been willing to look into these discrepancies because they're afraid that they'll be called names, they'll be called conspiracy theorists, that they'll lose their jobs. Journalists are not supposed to be intimidated so easily. Well, we've seen through history those who appease tyrants, whether it's the Roman emperor who took the Republic of Rome and turned it into an oppressive empire, to the rulers of Europe. When you appease these oppressors, you become a slave to them. And Americans don't want to believe that it can happen here. It has happened here. It's not just the product of movies about a future dystopian world that people say, oh, they come out of the movie theater, thank God. It's not like that. No, when they come out of the theater, they should understand it is like that. And it's getting more and more like that every day. We didn't just happen into this oppressive government overnight. For decades, what I refer to as the secret part of the government, the secret think tanks, the federal contract research centers that operate under classified, top secret, and above contracts, have generated paper after paper, report after report, all classified at a very high level on what they see as the future for the United States, the Rand Corporation, many other companies like that deal directly with the Pentagon. In the 1950s and 60s, the Rand Corporation got its start by coming up with the single integrated operational plan, which basically talked about a nuclear war and how many megadeaths the United States could experience in an all-out nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union. From the seeds of this insanity, we now have these same think tanks operating in secret, coming up with ways and methods on how to control the American public that are scared about the possibility of a pandemic killing millions of people, a debilitating terrorist attack that wouldn't be planes into buildings or bombings of marathons, but nuclear, biological, and chemical attacks. This is all designed to bring about the goal of turning the United States into a surveillance society. We already know that people who were officials of the Stasi in the old East Germany have said, we could have only dreamed of the technology that NSA is using today to monitor not only Americans but people around the world. But they've also cautioned, although we dreamed of it, we think this is very dangerous. So for the United States to be lectured by old retirees from the East German Stasi is really, it's beyond, it's beyond anything anyone would have thought of in the past, that we now have ex-Stasi officers telling the United States you've gone too far. We had the famous Stanley Kubrick movie, Dr. Strangelove, where the George C. Scott character, General Turgidson, says, if we have an all-out nuclear exchange with the Soviets, Mr. President, 65 million tops. Now, I'm not saying we won't get our hair a little mussed up, but in that fictional dark comedy, the Rand Corporation was called the Bland Corporation. They came up with a plan for a survivable nuclear war with the Soviet Union. But it wasn't just fiction. The Single Integrated Operational Plan, the PSYOP, was developed by Rand Corporation to suggest that the U.S. could withstand multiple nuclear strikes in an all-out exchange war, nuclear war with the Soviet Union. And this is where Rand Corporation made its money. And then Rand Corporation continued to be relied on by the secret government to come up with all sorts of scenarios and plans. Of course, the only people that didn't know about these were the people who were paying the taxes, paying the money for these nonsensical reports. But we now have the Rand Corporation and similar federal contract research centers operating under classified contracts, coming up with all kinds of scenarios. How they're going to control the country if there's a pandemic, an outbreak of some disease that may come in from another country or may be developed right here. The plans are put in place under the authority of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, which most of its work is classified. And then when we see there's a real need for FEMA to do something like the Gulf oil disaster with the British Petroleum Deepwater Horizon or Hurricane Katrina, we see these bumbling federal bureaucrats not able to respond to a real disaster because they've spent so much time on these science fiction-like futuristic disasters of pandemics, Andromeda strains, nuclear terrorist attacks, things like that. That's because these are all done to condition the American people to put in place the secret part of the government, how the government will react to these scenarios that may or may not ever happen.
Now you can watch The Alex Jones Show live as it happens at Infowars.com/show.
You'll find links to all of our content there and a free 15-day trial for Prison Planet TV.
More than 60 movies and documentaries all in one place at Infowars.com/show.
Are we choosing our own paths, our own destiny, or has it been pre-selected for us?
C.S. Lewis said, when training beats education, civilization dies.
We need to always be cognizant of, as a free society, that information can be used as a weapon.
Barrier to discovery is not ignorance. It's the illusion of knowledge.
We are seen as nothing but biological androids.
To gain control of education in America, not for a philanthropic purpose, but to change the thinking of the American people.
From the time we're very young, we're taught to, worship authority basically because that's our key to survival as young children.
Discover the history, the present, and the future of mind control From compulsory state education to the Hollywood media brainwashing machine, we are kept in perpetual bondage to the ideas that shape our actions.
In the CIA, scientists could actually film people who had been surreptitiously dosed with LSD.
There's a brain entrainment process that takes place.
That gives the government free rein to create whatever story or narrative it wants to create.
Whatever the public face of something is, whatever they're talking about publicly, there's something else over here they're probably not looking at.
How to engineer the opinion of the American people so that they would fully endorse, not only endorse, but demand a war.
When you watch mainline establishment television, you are putting yourself in front of the barrel of a gun. Discover the history, the present, and the future of mind control, psychological warfare, brainwashing. Are we controlled and manipulated? You bet.
That's mind control par excellence.
Find out how deep the rabbit hole really goes with this new groundbreaking documentary film, State of Mind. Available exclusively at Infowars.com.
There have been so many politicians. For example, the late New York Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who looked at this penchant for secrecy in the United States. He said it's got to stop. He also advocated taking the Central Intelligence Agency, breaking it up, getting rid of all the special operations units, all the paramilitary operations, and taking the intelligence analysts at the CIA and putting them back into the U.S. Department of State from which they originally came. That was quite a bold statement by Senator Moynihan, although I will add that statement came from Senator Moynihan after he decided to retire from the U.S. Senate. There are very, very few elected leaders of this country that are willing to take on this super secret state that has been developed throughout the Cold War, then the post-Cold War, and now the year of terrorism. When the communist bloc threat disappeared, they had to replace it with something else. And what they replaced it with was terrorism. So we've gone from the communists being the enemy to the terrorists being the enemy to now the lone wolf, the American citizen, being the enemy. This is the slippery slope we were often warned about. And people say, oh, slippery slope, slippery slope. It's happened. A few days before President Dwight D. Eisenhower, the famous general from World War II, left the presidency, he gave a televised speech from the White House where he warned America about the dangers of the military-industrial complex and how it could destroy our democratic form of government. He handed off the responsibilities to President John F. Kennedy, who, when faced with the Central Intelligence Agency's abominable plans to assassinate Fidel Castro, invade Cuba, get the United States into a possible nuclear war with the Soviet Union, he told the head of the CIA, Allen Dulles, I'm going to take your agency and destroy it. We don't need that in this country. And instead of destroying the CIA was involved in destroying President Kennedy, murdering him in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963. Kennedy was replaced by Lyndon Johnson, who gave the intelligence community and the Pentagon everything they wanted. And since the days of Lyndon Johnson, we have never had a president who has been willing to take on these power structures, like the CIA, like the FBI. Lyndon Johnson would never fire J. Edgar Hoover as director of the FBI because Hoover had so much information on Johnson. He even had more information on Richard Nixon, Johnson's successor. And anytime we saw a president like Jimmy Carter try to do something, Jimmy Carter was set up with the hostage situation in Iran and the October surprise, which ensured that the U.S. hostages would not be released before the 1980 election. President Kennedy, who heard Eisenhower's warning about the military-industrial complex and heeded it, also took action when he realized that the Joint Chiefs of Staff had concocted something called Operation Northwoods, which was going to use terrorist events staged by the Pentagon to blame on Cuba to justify a massive U.S. retaliation against that country. These included staging terrorist bombings at public events, hijacking aircraft and crashing them into buildings, and other similar false flag terror attacks, not created in Moscow by the KGB or by Fidel Castro's government in Havana, but by the American Department of Defense and the secret state, by the CIA, by the paramilitary secret organizations that existed in the Pentagon. Kennedy put an end to that, but Kennedy also then let it be known he wasn't going to tolerate that kind of behavior any longer. So he fell victim to one of the very same secret operations he was so adamantly opposed to. So we go from Operation Northwoods in the early 1960s to the Boston Marathon bombing in 2013. And what do we see at play? We see the Washington, D.C. news helicopters hovering over the home of a man named Ruslan Sarny, who had changed his name from Tsarnaev, the uncle of Tamerlan and Johar Tsarnaev, who lived in a very, very expensive home in the D.C. suburbs in Montgomery County, Maryland. And it turns out that he was associated in business with the CIA's long-serving Middle East expert, Afghan expert, Graham Fuller. We also found out that Tamerlan Tsarnaev was attending 6 months of training seminars in Tbilisi in the Republic of Georgia, sponsored by the Jamestown Foundation, which was started by CIA Director William Casey in 1984. So we have a non-government organization, the Jamestown Foundation, funded by the Central Intelligence Agency, sending Tamerlan Tsarnaev into Dagestan from the Republic of Georgia. He's attending training seminars in Tbilisi in the Republic of Georgia that involve people associated with the CIA, and then we're told he's a member of some sort of Al-Qaeda affiliated organization. Well, he is, because when we look at the whole history of Al-Qaeda and all of its franchises, Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, Al-Qaeda here, Al-Qaeda there, it all tracks back to the CIA and the Mujahideen support operations of the 1980s that involved Vice President George H.W. Bush and a plethora of people, including Mr. Casey at the CIA. So we go full circle. The people that were accused of carrying out the Boston Marathon bombing were associated with CIA activities, with people with long histories in the Central Intelligence Agency. But after this information came out, the word came from above, don't pursue these angles any longer. So after the news choppers disappeared from Montgomery County, flying over Uncle Ruslan Sarny's home, there was no more information on the CIA connections. We have people who were involved with the Tsarnaev brothers. One individual who lived in Orlando was killed by an FBI agent during an interview. He hadn't been charged with any crime. There was a huge amount of secrecy surrounding sending his body back to the Russian Federation. Why was all this secrecy put in place about somebody who knew the elder Tsarnaev brother? We also had information that the elder Tsarnaev was involved in the drug trade. Well, certainly when you mention the CIA and you mention Chechnya and you mention southern Russia and you mention the Republic of Georgia and Turkey, you're talking about major drug transshipment points that the CIA's been involved with in basically shipping opium from Afghanistan through the Caucasus into Europe. Where was all the follow-up by the media? Where was the front lines, the PBS? Where were all the other special investigative programs looking into these angles? They're not there any longer because public broadcasting is being defunded. The government doesn't want investigative reporting any longer because President Obama has basically criminalized investigative reporting, as any despot would want to do. He's no different than despots that have ruled other countries. They don't want state funding, obviously, for programs that are going to expose their criminal wrongdoings. And we saw the same thing with the lack of follow-up on the Boston Marathon, foreign connections, and the provable connections to the CIA. But filling the gap today, because we have InfoWars, we have independent journalists in the field, we were able to find out about some of the things that happened in Boston during and after the bombing. And it's because independent journalists were asking the questions that in one time in this country major network reporters would ask. And of course, when somebody who's not on the A-list of journalists in this country, who can't be controlled, ask a question, people get very uncomfortable. And they like to deny access. They like to threaten. They like to intimidate. That is the sign of journalism in a country that does not practice freedom of the press. We know that InfoWars reporter Dan Badandi in Boston courageously asked questions at the press conferences in the aftermath of the bombing and was threatened by the U.S. Secret Service. One can question now, why is there this coming together of jurisdictions from federal to state to municipal when there is an event where we have the federal government walking out of its bounds into local law enforcement matters? Because another sign of a tyranny, and we saw this with the Gestapo in Germany, and we saw it with the KGB in the Soviet Union, and the Stasi in East Germany, is there is no division of labor when it comes to security. It's one security unit, and it answers to the same boss. And that's what we're seeing more and more in the United States with the fusion of federal, state, and municipal law enforcement functions, where all people wearing any sort of law enforcement uniform answer to the same boss. And in the United States, that boss is the President of the United States acting through the Attorney General and the Secretary of Homeland Security. The news media has known that the administration has been wanting to go directly to the American people without the media being able to parse and question and take out what's clearly propaganda from the administration. They want to have this direct feed and bypass the media. And the media, by ignoring what the White House is doing, has slit its own throat, because we're now almost to the point where we don't need the anchormen. We don't need the White House reporters. We don't need people in the White House press room asking questions, because these people are not needed when you're doing direct feeds from the White House to the American public. So we have now reached the precipice where the government will be delivering news and their opinion, and there will not be any room for any sort of questions, dissent, other opinions. That is not in the cards. For many, many years, independent observers, independent truth tellers were warning about what the government was doing, about how they were aiding and abetting and financing Al-Qaeda. And we've come full circle to now the United States, with the support of the U.S. Congress, with the support of people in the opposition political party like Senator John McCain, advocating arming rebel groups in Syria that are absolutely known to be affiliated with al-Qaeda. The al-Nusra Front, for example, which has committed heinous human rights abuses, where their fighters have eaten human organs on film, to the point where President Vladimir Putin of Russia had to say, what in the world is wrong with the West when they support people who commit acts of cannibalism on human organs on television? That's where we are today. And the U.S. supporting al-Qaeda in Syria, we supported them in Libya. Muammar Gaddafi said that, I don't understand, why are the Americans, why are the NATO countries supporting al-Qaeda in eastern Libya? And he was scoffed at. How ridiculous. Gaddafi was telling the truth. President Assad is telling the truth about what the rebels represent. So it's now admitted that al-Qaeda is the key member of the rebel faction in Syria. Where does the money come from? It comes from America's military allies, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, where the United States has military bases. Woe be it to someone who doesn't look at a map of the Middle East and is able to figure out it's the United States government that's supporting the most radical forms of Islam, including rebel groups affiliated with al-Qaeda against secular governments in the Middle East, in Libya, in Syria, in Egypt. And therefore, Obama, who's very, very sensitive to any sort of ridiculous accusations that he's a secret Muslim from Kenya, is putting himself in the position of having to defend himself from people who say, well, maybe you're not, but why is your foreign policy looking like you are a radical Muslim from East Africa? Because every decision you're making is helping Saudi Arabia, helping Wahhabist, the most radical form of Islam, against secular governments where women have the right to vote. Women don't have to wear a veil. Women can have any job they want based on their qualifications. To take countries like Syria and Libya and turn them back into the 13th century because the U.S. is allowing Qatar and Saudi Arabia and members of the Muslim Brotherhood to pump all kinds of weapons and money and personnel who have killed American troops in Afghanistan and Iraq, fighting the secular Syrian government with arms provided by the United States. The United States, the Obama administration, siding with the most radical elements in the Middle East after they conditioned the American people to hate radical Muslims because we were told they carried out the 9/11 attack on the United States, for the government now to turn around and try to anesthetize the American public about these radical groups because we're now supporting them in their attempt to overthrow the government of Syria, an independent country, is mind-boggling. It's beyond absurd. But the administration knows that they can get the American public to turn on a dime because of their constant conditioning of the American public to accept a new reality. The government controls the means of communications with the American public. So the American government, if it doesn't like the reality they've created, in 30 minutes they can change it. Well, that's what Karl Rove said. He said, we control the media in this country, therefore we control the reality, and if we don't like the reality we've created, just like in the fictional movie Wag the Dog, we can change that reality in 30 minutes or so. The famous Marine Corps General Smedley Butler said in the 1930s, he said, war is a racket. He led Marine Corps invasions of countries in the Caribbean and Central America, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Nicaragua, Mexico. And he later said, you know, we were just foot soldiers for the guys on Wall Street. It had nothing to do with national security. We were working for the big moneyed interests on Wall Street. That's exactly where we are today, except Wall Street has become even more powerful. So the military does not go into other countries to protect the United States. It goes into other countries to protect the interests of the moneyed mega banks, the hedge funds, the vulture venture capitalists of Wall Street. When the United States goes into a Libya, it has nothing to do with U.S. national security. It has everything to do with grabbing Libya's oil. When the United States funds al-Qaeda in Syria, it has nothing to do with U.S. national security. It has to do with opening up Syria for new pipelines to be built from the Middle East into Turkey and into Europe. These decisions are made in Wall Street, not even necessarily in the Pentagon. And Smedley Butler had it right in the 1930s, and if he were around today, he would just shake his head. He said, I warned you, but I see my warnings were to no avail. We're at a point in this country where there's no easy way out. And we know with the Edward Snowden case, Edward Snowden has gone from Hong Kong to a transit lounge in Moscow. He's in limbo. The United States government has threatened every country in the world who would give this individual asylum that they will face trade sanctions. They will face all kinds of punishment. So we are now in a position where even if you want to leave the United States, where do you go today to be far away from the long reach of what's becoming a tyrannical government? There's not a whole lot of options available. We see it every day now in the United States where people want to make their tormentors, their oppressors, like them. They don't want to irritate them. We see it at the airport on a regular basis with the TSA checks, where government employees in uniforms are demanding people do things. Take off your shoes, take off your belt. People who are in wheelchairs, people who are children, people who have mental problems and physical medical problems are harassed by these people. And we just say, oh, well, it's necessary because we don't want our plane to be hijacked and flown into a building. People are willing to give up their privacy and their own independence for this false sense of security. And we see TSA now spreading itself from airports to train stations to bus stations to shopping malls to theaters to sporting arenas. Soon there'll be TSA at checks on interstate highways. When you pay a toll, you'll have to also show your identification, because the American people have been so taken in with this quote-unquote Stockholm Syndrome. They want to make their kidnappers, their oppressors, their tormentors like them, not the other way. It's not demand that this stop. They want to be complicit in their own abuse. Tyranny's here. You want to lay down in the face of tyranny, you're going to be run over by it. The only option is to stand up and be counted.
The mainstream news media. While Americans rely on it daily for the latest reports on world and domestic events, a recent study conducted by the Cronkite School of Journalism indicates that nearly 67% of Americans don't trust major media for accurate reporting. Ask Americans specifically why they distrust the media, and the answers are generally vague. After all, reports of news media abuses aren't normally found on the front page or the nightly news. Nonetheless, they do exist. Dateline NBC, a primetime news program, airs a story in 1992 entitled Waiting to Explode. The story includes footage demonstrating that a line of trucks produced by General Motors readily explode on impact.
To see for ourselves what might happen in a side impact crash, Dateline NBC hired the Institute for Safety Analysis to conduct crash demonstrations. Unlike GM tests, the fuel tanks were filled with real gasoline. Look what happened. At impact, a small hole was punctured in the tank. According to our experts, the pressure of the collision and the crushing of the gas tank forced gasoline to spew from the gas cap. The fuel then erupted into flames when ignited by the impacting car's headlight.
After the program airs, one of the firemen at the taping of the crash contacts GM. The conversation inspires a full-scale investigation. 3 months later, NBC is forced to reveal their role in fabricating the news.
NBC's contractor did put incendiary devices under the trucks to ensure that there would be a fire if gasoline were released from the truck's gas tank.
We said the crash, quote, forced gasoline to spew from the fuel cap, end quote. GM says since the gas cap was the wrong cap for the GM filler tube, and because the gas tank was overfilled, the cap came off when the impact occurred.
We agree with GM that we should have told our viewers about these devices.
The Dateline reporter, however, said, quote, at impact, a small hole was punctured in the tank, unquote. GM has now x-rayed that tank and found no hole.
We acknowledge the placing of the incendiary devices under the truck was a bad idea from start to finish.
That's our new policy, and we'll be right back.
After the 1995 bombing of the Murrah Federal Building, information came to light that contradicted government claims disseminated through the mainstream media. One source was Carol Howe, a government informant. She revealed that federal agencies had prior knowledge of the terrorist plot and were ignoring several figures linked to the bombing. Roger Charles is a retired Marine colonel and former correspondent at ABC News. His news team interviewed Howe and obtained confirmation of her testimony.
So here we had confirmation from a government representative in Denver with the McVeigh Prosecution Task Force saying, your facts are accurate. So we think we've got a slam dunk story. It will be a piece of cake to get it on air now because we have confirmation from a government spokeswoman that our facts are true.
The story was ready to air on ABC Evening News, but to Charles' surprise, the story never ran.
A few minutes later, a phone rang. Tom Gerald from ABC 2020 was on the phone to Thrasher saying the story had been killed for the evening. Didn't know why, but the decision in New York was not to run the story on Peter Jennings' nightly news that night.
In order for the story to air, Charles reworked it following suggestions from New York.
Well, the next morning, Don Thrasher gets a call from New York, and he gives me one of these. I couldn't believe it. I knew what the signal was. The story was not going to go again.
In 1990, an age-old conflict in the Balkans erupted into civil war. A multi-sided and complicated overseas struggle was packaged by the mainstream media as a tidy melodrama. The predominantly Christian Serbs were cast as the villains. A key maneuver employed to demonize them involved a photo shoot.
The news has always been used to stampede our reason with a perception and emotion. When you're talking about war, you get those heart-tugging appeals to pity in particular, and we've seen that again using images.
Benjamin Works, president of the Strategic Issues Research Institute, is a military affairs analyst for Fox News and CNN. He recalls the emergency shelters set up by the Serbs to accommodate Bosnian refugees.
I remember very vividly seeing tours by the camp commander showing the mess hall, showing food that, I wouldn't pay money for, but I'd gladly eat if it were free. And yet this was turned into a sensational story about concentration camps. And the propaganda twist on that came out of both the electronic media and the newspapers and very glaring covers on Time magazine and such.
Judgment, an independent expose, reveals how a British film crew photographed a Bosnian emergency shelter to look like a Nazi concentration camp. The film crew positioned themselves inside a barbed wire enclosure to shoot out at refugees, who were free to come and go as they pleased. The cameras zeroed in on a refugee whose emaciated appearance was the result of a birth defect.
We found that all of these allegations of a concentration camp were really frauds perpetrated by the reporters, and in fact, at least one, Roy Gutman, won a Pulitzer Prize for this kind of fabrication.
And the image that helped motivate American involvement in an overseas entanglement was a total fake.
Joe Lockhart, Peter Mayer of CBS News, Steve Holland of Reuters, the incoming Vice President, Jay Leno, host of NBC's Tonight Show, Lori Santos of United Press International, Karin Jurgensen, editor of USA Today, Helen Thomas of UPI, Dean of the White House Press Corps.
The star system has definitely crept into the media to the point where, although there used to be journalistic standards and something of a Chinese wall between the media pros and the newsmakers, that's been blurred, particularly by the administration, which has deliberately cultivated media personalities who are now present as guests at White House state dinners. And they don't seem to see any compromise of ethics or any conflict of interest in that.
The executives, the editors in print media, the senior producers, executive producers in the visual media, these are the people that have the ideological bias and, what's probably almost as important, the personal friendships. They go to the same country clubs, they go to the same dinners, they socialize with a lot of the people that they cover.
And yet this is where corruption sets into any system. When the censors and the monitors become friendly with the people they monitor, that's when standards fly out the window.
Today, standards in mainstream news reporting have more to do with career enhancement than reporting the truth.
Of course, to get ahead in a bureaucracy by giving the boss what he wants, that's how you get ahead. So again, that is indicative of why there's so much homogenization in the media.
You know, if you wanted to look at a pyramid, in the first couple layers, the really eager, hard-working young journalists are out there trying to get the stories, trying to make a name so they can move up that pyramid. Well, the further they move up the pyramid, the more they realize that, you know, the outlets really aren't interested in major news that rocks the boat.
The boat Charles refers to belongs to those at the top of the pyramid, where the interests of the media outlets are quietly defined. The year is 1917, and Representative Oscar Callaway enters a disturbing statement into the U.S. congressional record. The statement reveals why J.P. Morgan interests hired 12 high-ranking news managers. The 12 were asked to determine the most influential newspapers in America. They were to figure out how many news organizations it would take to control generally the policy of the daily press of the United States. The 12 found it was only necessary to purchase the control of 25 of the greatest papers. An agreement was reached. The policy of the papers was bought, and an editor was placed at each paper to ensure that all published information was in keeping with the new policy. Soon, that policy would be defined by a front group formed by J.P. Morgan and his colleagues. In fact, Morgan's personal attorney was founding president of the organization, the Council on Foreign Relations. Today, the CFR maintains that its goal is to increase America's understanding of the world. However, the actual objective of this highly exclusive club is revealed by the rare admissions of the insiders themselves. In the early 60s, a Georgetown University professor collects information for a book favorable to the network of powerful men who founded the CFR. For 2 years, Professor Carroll Quigley is allowed to examine the confidential papers and secret records of this network. Quigley reveals that these men aim to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. In short, they seek total and quiet control of the entire world. And the CFR is their most visible conduit for carrying out that agenda. CFR members include America's wealthiest tycoons, as well as the highly placed elite in government, academic institutions, tax-exempt foundations, and the establishment media. Ruling Class Journalists, written by Richard Harwood, describes the CFR membership as the ruling establishment in the United States. The Washington Post article boasted that news reporters who are CFR members do not merely analyze and interpret foreign policy for the United States, they help make it. Who are these policymakers? Many of their faces are familiar. NBC's Tom Brokaw, CBS's Dan Rather, ABC's Barbara Walters, Jim Lehrer of PBS, William F. Buckley of National Review, media mogul Rupert Murdoch, owner of the giant multifaceted News Corporation. These media heavyweights, and many others like them, are members of the CFR. Powerful corporations are also invited to become members. At the close of the 20th century, CFR influence presided over far-reaching consolidations of media control. In 1995, CFR members Michael Eisner of Disney and ABC's Thomas Murphy merged their media empires. Soon after the merger, the Disney-ABC empire becomes a CFR corporate member. In the year 2000, the world's largest internet service provider, America Online, joins forces with Time Warner, one of the world's largest news organizations. The CEOs favoring the move are CNN's Thomas Johnson and Time Warner's Gerald Levin, both CFR members. Once again, another media giant is created under the shadow of CFR influence. Today, an elite handful of individuals define the agendas that are supported by the empire of establishment news. One of the CFR's strongest media allies is the New York Times. As a major outlet for the establishment viewpoint, the Times has achieved dominant influence over the reporting of national and international news. The Times is relied upon by many editors in the mainstream news media for direction on how to portray world events. In addition, the Times wire service retails the establishment line to subsidiary outlets such as broadcast news distributors and regional newspapers. Competition between these outlets rests primarily on the style of regurgitating the same message. In the early 1930s, Americans received much of their news about life in the Soviet Union from Walter Duranty, the New York Times man in Moscow. Duranty's articles filled the front pages with gripping stories from Mother Russia. During that period, Joseph Stalin was consolidating power over the captive nations that formed the Soviet Union. One step in that drive called for the forced relocation of millions of Ukrainians. Observing these events on the scene was British journalist Malcolm Muggeridge. He witnessed the loading of thousands of Ukrainians into boxcars. They were being deported to barren regions of the Soviet Union. This program of Stalin's alone accounted for more than 1 million deaths.
This is the most terrible thing I've ever seen. It precisely because of the deliberation with which it was done and the total absence of even any kind of sympathy.
Duranty's articles in the New York Times sharply contradicted Muggeridge's reports. Duranty went out of his way to dismiss them as bunk or sheer absurdity. During the deliberate famine of 1932 to 1933, more than 7 million Ukrainians perished when Stalin seized their entire grain crop for export. Still in a March 1933 article, Duranty insisted there is no actual starvation or deaths from starvation, but there is widespread mortality from diseases due to malnutrition.
That was when his reporting was particularly disgraceful, because he denied that there was any famine. And we used to wonder whether, in fact, the authorities hadn't got some kind of hold over him, because he so utterly played their game. But it didn't worry the New York Times, who featured his reports.
Ultimately, the cover-up of Stalin's crimes helped the communist regime gain diplomatic recognition from the United States. William F. Jasper is a senior editor for the New American Magazine.
The Soviet Union, like every communist country, was an economic basket case. It could not produce enough to survive. And so every communist socialist state has been dependent upon aid from the capitalist producing states. So Russia was desperate for our aid, both in terms of direct government aid, but also in terms of opening up the spigots for the private capital markets, particularly New York bankers and corporations, to move into Russia in a big way.
In 1933, the Roosevelt administration invited a Soviet representative to Washington to negotiate terms of diplomatic recognition. For his news correspondence during the previous year, Duranty would receive the Pulitzer Prize. Another Times correspondent, Herbert Matthews, also covered for collectivism. During the so-called Spanish Civil War in the late 1930s, communists throughout Spain brutally massacred more than 6,000 priests, friars, and nuns. Matthews' dispatches, however, depicted the communists as idealistic Democrats seeking to liberate Spain from tyranny. No mention was made of the communist atrocities. Later, when the Times assigned Matthews to report on Cuba, he crafted an image of an obscure revolutionary as a romantic and idealistic hero, supported by thousands of Cubans. Matthews' stories set the stage for a campaign to bring Fidel Castro to power. As other observers noted, Castro got his job through the New York Times. Meanwhile, Matthews' reports assured Americans that Castro definitely was not a communist. After seizing power, Castro began eliminating all potential internal opposition. Firing squads operated day and night. Matthews' reaction to Castro's slaughtering was callous. Youth must sow its wild oats. Despite his blatantly pro-communist reporting, the Times kept Matthews on staff for over 45 years. The establishment media's backing of Matthews and Duranty points to the existence of a larger policy to legitimize communism.
Communism is the most absolute form of government, the highest concentration of government. And so you actually have in the communist system a rule by an oligarchic few, a rule by an elite. That is precisely what the Council on Foreign Relations insiders have been pushing for in this country and throughout the world throughout the past century. So there is a natural confluence of interest there, not an antagonism between the communists and the internationalists here in our government. They are both after the same thing.
The elite, however, occasionally have a difficult time ruling themselves. At a 1991 closed-door meeting of fellow internationalists, billionaire and former CFR chairman David Rockefeller praised his media allies, but his confidence that his words would not leave the room was later broken.
We are grateful to the Washington Post, the New York Times, Time Magazine, and other publications whose directors have attended our meetings and restricted their promises of discretion for almost 40 years. It would have been impossible for us to develop our plan for the world if we had been subject to the bright lights of publicity. But the world is now more sophisticated and prepared to march toward a world government.
Redirecting the bright lights of publicity is not the media's only contribution towards such a plan. Up next, discover how support for world government is generated as we examine some of the biggest stories in recent decades. The disturbing truth begins behind the big news. With literally millions of events occurring around the world every day, the media simply can't report on all of them. But like the Times slogan, all the news that's fit to print, the mainstream media implies that they can be depended on to report what is significant. What isn't made clear is exactly who or what dictates which events are newsworthy and which are not. This form of media censorship has proved catastrophic to American interests. In the midst of the Vietnam War, North Vietnamese leaders gambled on a bold strategy to achieve a decisive military victory in South Vietnam. Communist strategists believed a general offensive could trigger a civilian uprising and force America to abandon the war. Instead of their traditional hit-and-run guerrilla tactics, they massed their forces for a major confrontation with American and South Vietnamese units. On January 30th, 1968, under the cover of a truce for the Vietnamese New Year, or Tet, Communist forces launched a well-coordinated nationwide attack on South Vietnamese cities. The Tet Offensive had begun. Although caught by surprise, American forces responded quickly and effectively to the attacks. The main force Viet Cong were literally wiped out as a threat in South Vietnam. What was left of the communist forces from the north retreated across the borders. The Tet Offensive turned out to be a communist failure and a huge U.S. military victory. In America, however, media reports of the Tet Offensive communicated a much different message.
The battle for Hue has taken an odd turn here.
Americans were led to believe that the escalation in fighting proved that America, like the French, could not win in Vietnam.
To say that we are closer to victory today is to believe, in the face of the evidence, the optimists who have been wrong in the past. To say that we are mired in stalemate seems the only realistic, if unsatisfactory, conclusion. But it is increasingly clear to this report that the only rational way out then will be to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could. This is Walter Cronkite. Good night.
Even retired President Lyndon Johnson expressed anger over the misleading reports.
Immediately, the voices just came out of the holes in the wall and said, let's get out. And that's what Ho Chi Minh had been trying to do all the time, was to win in Washington what he had won in Paris. To win in this country, in the homes of this country, what he could not win from the men out there that represented us.
Communist leader and Viet Cong former Minister of Justice, Trung Nhu Tang, later confirmed the U.S. media's critical role in determining the outcome of the war.
After the Tet Offensive, what we lost on the military front, we won on the diplomatic and psychological fronts. Above all, on the fourth front, the mass media, the press, television.
We have just had, I've been advised, some film in from the defense.
First, we have sourced the meltdown.
Even after 3 decades, the performance of the American press hasn't changed much. In 1998, America's attention was focused on scandal in the Oval Office. Public concern over this new round of suspected Clinton wrongdoings finally pushed Congress to act. However, news coverage implied that purely mean-spirited partisanship motivated the proceedings.
The great story here is this vast right-wing conspiracy that has been conspiring against my husband since the day he announced for president. Suddenly,
for the first time since Richard Nixon, a United States president faced the strong possibility of impeachment. Yet only a handful of viewers would learn the actual reasons why. Months before the Lewinsky scandal broke, Congress began investigating a scandal that had become known as Chinagate. Evidence suggested that the Clinton administration had compromised U.S. security in order to finance its re-election campaign. The Communist government of China was eager to acquire sensitive U.S. military technology and economic concessions. Through international money laundering, China funneled contributions into U.S. election campaigns and obtained privileged access to top U.S. officials. The communist money trail led all the way up to the Oval Office. If these facts were widely publicized, Clinton would face impeachment on grounds of bribery, and perhaps even treason. But the media misdirected public attention. Americans were told over and over again in 1,000 different ways that the only real complaints against Clinton were that he lied about sex. Yet more than a dozen of Clinton's appointees, business associates, and close friends were convicted of felonies since he assumed office in 1993. Many others implicated in the Chinagate scandal invoked the Fifth Amendment or fled the country altogether. William Norman Grigg is a senior editor for the New American magazine.
If Bill Clinton had been forced out of office as a result of the Lewinsky scandal, the damage would have been limited to him. And he was disposable to that extent. But if there had been serious attention paid in Congress and by the public to the implications of the Chinagate bribery and treason scandal, there was a whole host of institutions vital to the power elite that would have been implicated.
The media cover-up of Chinagate was not simply to protect Bill Clinton. It was to protect the larger agenda that Bill Clinton had facilitated. That was the transfer of enormous technology, critical military technology, to Communist China.
My name is Jimmy Carter, and I'm running for president.
During the 1976 campaign for president, the establishment media gave preferential treatment to an unknown governor from a southern state. One of Jimmy Carter's favorite themes was that if he were elected, he would bring new faces and new ideas to Washington. He repeatedly told audiences that he was not beholden to the Washington and New York-based establishment that had been running things for so long. At a Boston rally, Carter said, "The people of this country know from bitter experience that we are not going to get these changes merely by shifting around the same group of insiders. The insiders have had their chance, and they have not delivered." After Carter was elected, however, he quickly forgot his promise of new faces and ideas. His administration was packed with individuals from the same crowd of insiders that had been running things for decades. For National Security Advisor, Carter selected Zbigniew Brzezinski, a board member of the CFR. Brzezinski inducted Carter into the establishment shortly before the media helped boost Carter's status to national prominence. President of the John Birch Society, John F. McManus.
The Democrats are out, the Republicans are in, the Republicans are out, the Democrats are in, and the socialistic internationalist program, the pro-UN attitude, continues. The American people are the losers. They are not being given the proper alternatives. And it's the job of the media to do that kind of thing. We like to think, and people in the media like to think, that they're the ones that dig out the real issues and so forth. They don't. They don't dig out the real issues. There are some areas that are off limits. You're not allowed to get into those things, such as the famous televised debate with Clinton and his Democratic opponents at the primary season in 1992. Here he was, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission, just like George Bush, but none of the opponents of Clinton for the Democrat nomination would bring it up. Tsongas, Kerry, Harkin, Jesse Jackson, Douglas Wilder, it was ground that they would not touch, nor would the media touch, and it was a perfectly good issue.
From World War II to the present, the establishment has maintained its locked grip on the presidency. The subservient media keeps such information from becoming news. If it bleeds, it leads. This cynical saying, often regarding mainstream news, implies that violent or catastrophic reports are peddled as top stories.
Rising water, and the two planes collide.
Horrific or dramatic events alone create strong emotional responses. Add to that sweeping statements that stir public fear.
The police can't stop it.
Reports of war, nuclear threats, natural disasters, scandals, and murders often filled the daily news for reasons other than to inform. Preying upon fears viewers have concerning death and destruction is so frequently practiced by major news that most viewers are desensitized to the actual intent of the reports themselves.
Good evening. There are new and dire predictions tonight about the future of our planet. Around the world, glaciers are in full retreat. Some, like the ancient ice cap on Mount Kilimanjaro in Africa, could be gone in a decade or two. It's a dramatic symptom of the warming of the Earth, detailed in a new 1,000-page United Nations report, Climate Change 2001. It predicts the new century will bring, and I quote, large-scale and possibly irreversible changes affecting every last person on Earth.
Today's population has already set off an environmental spiral, depleting the world's forests and contributing to overfishing and overgrazing. Soil is being eroded, which in turn is hurting crop production, leading to starvation.
This is punishment, say scientists, for sins of the past, the end result of years of pollution, wildfires year-round in California. That 500-year flood that devastated Grand Forks, North Dakota, occurring every 5 years. Greenhouse gases that stay in the atmosphere 100 years after they're released. It is a doomsday scenario detailed in a report sponsored by the United Nations.
Sweltering summers, rising sea levels, more droughts, more violent storms. Global warming is real, the new report declares, and humans are helping to cause it.
By creating a crisis or a perception of crisis, you accomplish several things. First of all, people in a crisis do not think rationally. People in a crisis look around and say, geez, we have to do something. Something is upon us. And so in a panic atmosphere, crisis atmosphere, people are willing to accept more stringent controls.
No matter what the current news-hyped crises may be, the proposed solution by mainstream news remains consistent.
Global warming is real, and it's something that needs to be taken into account very seriously in policy decisions. And the emissions are a policy question.
If we don't move now, any chances that we have for conserving the environment, maintaining political stability, or offering opportunities to individuals will be totally washed away in the extraordinary load of so many people.
China, the world's most populated country, now controls the phenomenon by demanding its couples produce just one child, with harsh penalties for those who fail to comply. Most countries agree family planning should be a top priority. The UN begins setting the next decade's priorities on population.
Global warming, ozone depletion, overpopulation, deforestation, biodiversity, all of these are being presented as global crises, the equivalent of war, the things that demand immediate action for survival. In fact, we're told global survival is at stake here. And in each of these cases, we're told these are global crises that cannot be handled at the local and national level. They are global crises that require global solutions.
Today, Americans are told global warming will destroy the planet. However, only a few decades ago, they were told that the planet would be destroyed by a more chilling crisis.
What scientists are telling us now is that the threat of an ice age is not as remote as they once thought. If we are unprepared for the next advance, the result could be hunger and death on a scale unprecedented in all of history. During the lifetime of our grandchildren, Arctic cold and perpetual snow could turn most of the inhabitable portions of our planet into a polar desert.
Just as global crises are trumpeted as reasons to centralize government power, the media also manipulates local events to serve that goal as well. Take, for example, the gun. It's what the media blames for an epidemic of violence in our own backyard. In almost every story having to do with violence, the presence of a gun is the villain. Tragedies such as the shootings at Columbine are exploited to convince the public that the gun itself is to be more feared than those misusing it.
The debate is just talk until gun violence happens to you.
Investigative Reports airs on the Arts and Entertainment Network. This news program represents one of the many media formats that routinely insinuate that because guns are available, there is violence.
Every 20 seconds, a handgun is manufactured in the United States. And every 2 minutes, another person is shot. Leaving us all to ask, when will the bloodshed end?
But the media does not blame gun manufacturers alone for the violence. All those who possess firearms must share in the guilt. Responsible gun owners and those using guns recklessly or to commit crimes are lumped together in a single group. Notice how Investigative Reports edits footage together to insinuate that hunters are linked to urban street violence.
There is a war on the streets that is killing our children.
Ultimately, the media supports a revolutionary campaign to abolish the right to keep and bear arms.
Further complicating the lives of police officers is a new issue. the arming of the general public. Gun violence has increased dramatically in every sector of our society, but most alarmingly, with children.
As a culture of violence persists, its backlash has teens caught in a crossfire.
With so many guns in the hands of mostly untrained civilians, officers have no idea what they might face when they respond to a call. It's a recipe for disaster.
The media's message is clear. Americans will be a lot better off without guns.
The expression gun control is dishonest because we're not talking about controlling guns so much as we're talking about controlling the law-abiding segment of our population. The defining characteristic of a criminal, after all, is that he does not obey the laws, and gun control laws are no exception. Anytime you have a measure which has the effect of disarming the law-abiding, you're giving criminals a competitive advantage over the law-abiding segment of our population. And the media doesn't display much, if any, interest in reporting what happens in those instances where criminals go into an encounter with a citizen with the serene confidence that the citizen has been disarmed. That's a story the media just does not want to tell.
The mainstream media continues to portray the arrest of Rodney King as a gang of racist police beating a black victim.
It began, as we remember, after white policemen were seen on videotape beating a black man named Rodney King.
4 white police officers in the beating of black motorist Rodney King.
Captured by chance on home video, the arrest quickly became a national sensation. In the months that followed, the establishment media hyped this local event to the point that many Americans considered it to represent police behavior nationwide.
This could be any one of 20 major cities or more in the country. It's a time bomb that's ticking under the foundations of America's major cities and under our country itself.
To curb police brutality across the nation.
The verdict of not guilty for King's arresting officers served as the match that lit the fuse. Instantly, the media implied that the jury was a bunch of redneck racists.
We do have a society which is still racist.
A mostly white jury in rural Simi Valley cannot have any appreciation of what black people in south central Los Angeles go through when dealing with the Los Angeles Police Department.
There the man was on the ground, covering up toward the end, being beaten to insensitivity, and this all-white jury decided that the police were the good guys.
Yet the testimony of 58 witnesses and over 200 exhibits presented at the trial revealed to the jury much of what the media kept hidden. King attracted highway patrol attention because he was driving recklessly at speeds of up to 115 miles per hour. His arrest culminated an 8-mile chase in which he cut across numerous lanes of expressway traffic and ran red lights. King was a convicted felon, out on parole for armed robbery. There were 2 other black passengers in King's car, but they cooperated with the officers, were handcuffed, and later released without incident. King was under the influence of drugs and alcohol. King initially ignored police orders to step out of the car. When he did come out, he began acting erratically, dancing around. Then he shook his backside in a lewd gesture at a female police officer. Ignoring officers' demands to get down on the ground, King was tackled by 4 officers. He rose up and threw off the officers. An officer attempted to subdue King with a stun gun, but even the taser darts fired at King failed to keep this out-of-control 260-pound man down. At this point, the arrest was recorded on home video. Like the jury, you were about to witness the first few seconds that the media carefully avoided broadcasting. King is seen rising up and charging one of the arresting officers. The response of the officers is history. Although people may look at the same evidence and disagree with the verdict, the fact remains the media withheld critical information from the American people in order to make the facts fit the story it wanted to tell. The story implies that local law enforcement is a failed institution and that radical changes are needed.
There's certainly nothing new about the drive to federalize control of local police. This is something that goes back decades. The major media have succeeded to a shocking extent in creating an impression for the general public that local police are not to be supported, not to be trusted, they are to be feared. And that, on the other hand, we can trust implicitly in the federal law enforcement agencies who will come into our communities and protect us against the local police. Local police exist to protect the rights and the liberties and the property of the law-abiding, and they are accountable to the communities that they serve. National police, on the other hand, would exist to protect the interests of the state and the political elite that controls the state.
The age-old tactics of revolutionaries is to orchestrate the illusion of popular support for their agendas. Media cooperation is essential to give life to the illusion.
We have had don't be fooled by the smoke and mirrors they use. The gun lobby is strong, they are organized, and they are scary. Enough of their tactics. They are buying votes with blood money.
Marketed as the Million Mom March, a publicity stunt created by gun disarmament advocates takes shape at the nation's capital.
Women and their families will push for gun safety in what they call the Million Mom March.
Weeks before the march actually took place, the media reports served as invitations for support and participation in the anti-gun agenda.
Dan, this Mom's March is going to bring enormous pressure on Congress.
Now to the emotional issue of gun control in the United States. The nation's capital is preparing for a demonstration against gun violence.
Organizing the ostensibly spontaneous march was Donna Dees Thomas's. Americans were told that Dees Thomas's was a mere suburban housewife and political novice who was shocked into action after watching the televised aftermath of a shooting at a daycare center. This portrayal of her background was repeated uniformly throughout the establishment media.
Women to watch, a suburban mother whose life has been changed by the gun debate, how she became a political activist, where that's led. That's a surprise to her friends and even to her. Here's NBC's Lisa Myers.
Donna Dees Thomas is a suburban mom, too busy with her 2 daughters and a part-time job to pay much attention to politics. Describes herself as apathetic.
No one ever turns out for rallies about gun control.
That's what you were told?
That's what I was told.
Undaunted, she decided to set up the march herself. What's the biggest thing you got organized before?
A carpool.
In reality, Dees Thomas's is a political veteran, a former congressional staffer and publicist for the CBS News. She is a shrewd, well-connected player for the media elite. Despite the prolonged, heavily financed and national anti-gun effort, the Million Mom March fell far short of its name. However, the low attendance didn't stop the media from promoting the illusion of a nationwide demand for more gun laws.
The media are trying to create the illusion that there is this massive outpouring of public support for disarming civilians in this country in the name of public safety, but this is an illusion. It's a carefully cultivated illusion, and it's intended to advance an agenda supported and promoted by the elite that controls the media, and that elite is trying to create a world government. In order to do so, it would be necessary, first of all, to disarm the targeted population that would be subject to that government.
Street demonstrators turned the area of the World Trade Organization conference into a war zone. Over 500 National Guardsmen and state police are called in to help restore order in what became known as the Battle of Seattle. Major media focused on the chaos and the mob's demands.
Let them go!
Yet they carefully avoided raising the issue as to how the groups on the street were organized and funded, or whether their leaders might have a hidden agenda. Instead, the media portrays such demonstrations as natural outpourings of genuine grassroots concern.
We're just normal people who are tired of the exploitation of multinational corporations.
Again, for those who orchestrate these events, it's the illusion that counts.
The familiar media melodrama of the anti-globalization movement that we have seen at Seattle and some of the other protest venues is really a classic example of bracketing an issue with false alternatives, because we're told that these are people who oppose the global agenda. After all, they're called anti-globalization activists. Well, what is it that they oppose? They don't oppose global government. They believe that there is too much free market capitalism in the world, and that government at a global level has to be more assertive in imposing controls over the free exchange of goods and services.
But you see that both of these sides are really calling for empowering the United Nations.
The media further stage manages the illusion of conflict by promoting those designated as the official opposition.
I'm going to focus on what the other side says and then what you say back.
The media-appointed spokesperson for the anti-WTO forces is Lori Wallach. She heads up Global Trade Watch. Ignored by the media is the fact that Wallach's organization receives funding from the Ford Foundation, which is closely tied to the CFR. The friendly relationship between Wallach and the CFR agenda was made clear in Foreign Policy magazine, a major conduit for CFR thinking. This issue signals media leaders that Lori Wallach should be represented as an expert on trade issues. By ensuring that only false opposition is offered to its revolutionary agenda, the CFR internationalists can't lose. The establishment media employs many deceptions to support the drive for global power. These deceptions go far beyond altering or omitting a few facts. The insiders count on the immensity of their illusions to prevent any sizable segment of the American public from catching on to their real motivation. CEO of the John Birch Society, G. Vance Smith.
A basic objective of the insiders, and has been from the beginning, has been to break the will to resist, to convince through their propaganda that there's no hope, that it's inevitable, that moving towards a one-world government, a one-world court system, a one-world military, a one-world currency, all of that is just inevitable. And they present it in a way that, again, convinces, they try to convince that the momentum is so great that it cannot be stopped.
But more than once, the insiders' momentum has been stopped. As Clinton began his second term, he chose veteran CFR member W. Anthony Lake for the highly sensitive post of Director of the CIA. But Senate approval would be required first. The establishment news quickly filled its editorial pages with glowing endorsements from fellow CFR members. But many issues in Lake's background should have raised doubts about his suitability for the top intelligence post. Of greatest concern was Lake's long history of associations with groups hostile to American national security. A group of political watchdogs supplied key senators with documentation, and the New American magazine helped mobilize public pressure for a thorough investigation. Embarrassed by the challenge to its leadership, the establishment media attempted to smear the organization, leading the demand for the investigation. Lake is a victim of the far right, the New York Times charged. In an error-ridden article in the New American, a John Birch periodical, William F. Jasper dissected Mr. Lake's resume and found a pattern of anti-Americanism.
He referred to my article as an error-ridden article, yet he cited not one error in the whole article, and it was clearly calculated to be a major defense and promo piece for Anthony Lake.
Despite strong media support for his nomination, Lake withdrew rather than subject himself to serious Senate scrutiny. Victories such as Lake's withdrawal are but part of the solution for reversing the establishment's momentum. To escape ongoing media deceptions, the public must first have a source of regular, reliable information. Many concerned Americans look to the New American. The magazine has a reputation for calling the shots years and sometimes decades ahead of mainstream media. Case in point, author William F. Jasper examines Osama bin Laden 3 years before the attack on the Pentagon and the World Trade Center. Jasper's report exposes the cover-up that prevents America from winning the war on terrorism. The New American reveals how Washington policymakers had earlier helped build Saddam Hussein's war machine and are using the monster they created as a pretext to build UN power. Newsweek covered some of this ground, although not until 10 years later.
To know what's going on isn't going to help a darn bit unless we do something with what we know. And again, an individual, even well-informed, can't stop this thing by themselves. So the purpose of our educational efforts is to get thousands and tens of thousands of individuals informed so that they can link arms and they can collectively have a voice that will resonate even as great as the billions of dollars resonate through the media. Truth will penetrate all of that.
Truth. It's the foundation upon which freedom is built. And it's one of the strongest weapons against the revolutionary agenda behind the big news.